Now you're free to speak.
Thank you, Mr. President. And can I thank the Senate for their indulgence? Mr. President, there's a new dichotomy in Australian politics. We have today in the opposition economic conservatives. We have in the government former economic conservatives. But they're much happier today because no longer do people in the government have to live a lie. Friends like Senator Carr can tax, they can spend, they can send the nation into debt as much as they like. And they're much, much happier about that. Senator Carr's old boss, former Premier Joan Kirner, said the other day that debt, she was so happy that debt was no longer out of fashion. The debt, in effect, for Ms Kirner is the new black. Debt is again fashionable. The former economic conservatives, the government, has a very interesting solution to the current economic crisis. All of us in this chamber know this, that the current economic crisis was caused by individuals and indeed by companies borrowing and spending far too much. In the United States, indeed elsewhere. Far too much money was borrowed and far too much money was spent by individuals and companies. And what's the solution? What is the solution offered by the government? Well, it's for governments to borrow and spend even more. That's the solution of the government. That after companies and individuals have spent too much and borrowed too much, the nation and governments should borrow and spend even more. That's the solution. It's a bit like drinking to cure a hangover. That's the analogy, you see, Mr. President. That's the idea the government has, to keep on spending and borrowing even more and more and more. There's been a lot of talk over the last 2 weeks, Mr. President, about political DNA, about what makes political parties tick, what makes political leaders tick. Well, I know a quick look at history will tell us about every single Labor government since Federation. What does it tell us? It tells us this, that every single federal Labor government puts our nation further into debt. Every time. There have been 10 Labor Prime Ministers and they have put this nation into further debt every time. And there's not one exception. Every time you have a Labor government, they put the country further into debt. Debt is always higher when Labor governments leave than when they arrive. Every single time. The farewell gift of Australia's previous 9 Prime Ministers, their farewell gift is more debt. And that is the iron rule of Australian federal politics. Every Labor government, more debt. Go right back to the first one, Chris Watson, who was only there for a short time, but there was more debt. And Andrew Fisher, he spent a lot. He created a lot more debt. Billy Hughes, again, a lot more debt. James Scullin, much, much more debt. John Curtin and Ben Chifley, again, far, far more debt. Far more debt than there was when they turned up to be Prime Minister. And then, of course, Mr Whitlam. We know what he did. What did he do? Borrowed, and there was more debt. It's consistent at least, Mr President. At least it's consistent. Always more debt. The one thing that's in the Labor DNA is debt. Every single time. And then, of course, Mr Hawke and Mr Keating. Well, funny, you know. They didn't start off so badly. But in the end, the DNA came out. And Mr Hawke and Mr Keating, they left this country in debt. $96 billion. And then finally, Mr Rudd. Mr Rudd also, after 6 months, spent $50 billion and put the country into debt again. 10 Labor Prime Ministers, Watson, Fisher, Hughes, Scullin, Curtin, Chifley, Whitlam, Hawke, Keating and Rudd, 10 out of 10, more debt. And there is not one exception. Every Labor Prime Minister creates further debt for this country. It is a disgraceful record. War and peace, good times and bad, there is always debt. Debt is the Labor Party's DNA. Not jobs, but debt. The excuses change, but it is always the same rationale, Mr. President. Debt, debt, debt and debt from every one of the last 10 Labor Prime Ministers. Now, there are some who doubted Mr. Rudd's commitment when he first came into Parliament, whether he would be a good Labor Prime Minister, because he didn't come from a union background. He was a former diplomat. And they were concerned that he may not know the Labor Party's ways. But they need not have worried, Mr. President. The Labor Party need not have worried, because he has the DNA. He has the debt gene. He has it. They need not have worried the Australian Labor Party. Mr. Rudd knows how to spend, and he knows how to put the nation into debt. He's never forgotten that. Mr. Rudd fits in perfectly with the other 9 former Labor Prime Ministers in creating further and further debt. Never forget, this country must never forget, that when Labor left office, they left this country and its people with $96 billion of debt, paying about $8 billion of interest each year to service that debt. That's what Mr. Hawke and Mr. Keating left this country, just like all the other Labor Prime Ministers. Debt. And they left it. And it's taken just 6 months. It's taken just 6 months for the Labor Party to spend over $50 billion. And also, of course, to extend a credit line to $200 billion. And, Mr. President, if that ever happens, that Labor, and it will, that Labor spends the $200 billion, we'll start to have the problem of structural debt. That what will happen, the budget every year, just like in Western Europe, gets consumed by interest on debt. It becomes part of the political culture and the fabric and the way of life of, let's say, France. And so much, 10% of the budget's taken up on interest repayments on debt. That's the problem, Mr. President. And this credit line of $200 billion, what that signifies is the fact that the Labor Party will do it if they feel it's necessary. Well, it's funny, you see, what worries me, you see, is Mr. Rudd talks about turbocharging social democracy. What he's done is turbocharge debt. Perhaps that's the same thing. That's the problem. The debt has gone up $50 billion in 6 months. Only twice in this nation's history. After the McMahon government, during the McMahon government, there was no net debt, no net government debt. And also, of course, under the Howard Costello government, there was no net government debt. What did Mr. Whitlam do as soon as he got in? He fixed that problem. He put the country back into debt. Back into debt. And what happened when Mr. Rudd got in? Back into debt, just like the other 9 Labor Prime Ministers. The one consistent fact of Australian political history, the one consistent political fact about Australian Labor governments is debt. And there are no exceptions. What a coincidence. We know what's in Labor DNA. It is debt. And there have been no exceptions. It's always the same. The Labor Party will bugger up the economy and they'll expect a coalition to fix it up. Happens every time. 10 Labor Prime Ministers and the coalition governments that take over will be expected to fix and pay up the debt. And it's a moral question, Senator Parry. This is a moral question. What about the intergenerational equity? What about that? Mr. Costello has spoken often about this. This is a moral issue. The Labor Party loves to talk about equity, but they don't mind bankrupting our children or our grandchildren to pay off the debt. It's all very well to spend on behalf of today's voters, but who's going to pay off the debt? Our children and our grandchildren will be saddled with the debt that these people create, just like all the other Labor governments. There are no exceptions. That's the one ironclad rule of Australian politics. They always said about the great dictators, Mr. President, they always said about the great dictators that the great dictators loved children, but the great dictators hated their parents. You can never accuse that of Mr. Rudd. He loves the parents. We're just not too sure if he loves the children, who will be saddled with the debt that he's creating today, along with the other 9 Labor Prime Ministers. Every Labor Prime Minister puts this nation further into debt. Every Labor Prime Minister puts this nation further into debt. The ironclad rule of Australian politics. And it is absolutely disgraceful, if it wasn't so scary. Labor spent their first year, let's not forget this, Mr. President, Labor spent their first year in office. How I remember Mr. Swan, Mr. Rudd, even Senator Conroy, saying the economy's overheated. The economy's overheated. The inflation genie's out of the bottle. They talked it down because the economy was overheated. Interest rates were going up. The economy was out of control. We said go for growth. They talked it down just at the time when the economy needed to be talked up, making the recession even worse. I will never forget the inflation genie was out of the bottle, 4%. The inflation genie was out of the bottle and things were so terrible, weren't they? Just so terrible. And now a few months later, now we know what economic terror is. Having talked down the economy. If you'd gone for growth, you wouldn't have had the problem. Instead, they kept talking down the economy and they failed to build up business and consumer confidence. So well done. You even got that wrong. Well done. First year in office, wrong. And what's the intellectual edifice? This change from being an economic conservative, what's it based on? Well, of course, it's political opportunism, but it's based on this voodoo economics is based on this famous essay of Mr. Rudd's in the Australian Monthly, Mr. President, of which, of course, I've read. The philosophy, if you call it that, is unusual because it reflects an unusual state of mind. Mr. Rudd's political and economic philosophy changes at every opportunity. He was a Christian socialist. Dietrich Bonhoeffer, the great German pastor, was his spiritual and economic social mentor. But he abandoned that and decided he was a neoliberal when he was after the shadow treasuryship before the 2004 election under Mr. Latham. He was trailing his coattails with Mr. Latham and through Labor caucus, saying he was a neoliberal. So, in fact, he'd gone from the German Dietrich Bonhoeffer to the Austrian Friedrich Hayek in a very short amount of time. And then, of course, upon becoming opposition leader, he called himself self-styled an economic conservative, and he was proud of it. Very, very proud of it. Mr. Rudd was so proud of styling himself an economic conservative. He was out and proud about being an economic conservative. There wasn't any difference between him and Mr. Howard at all, really. He was Howard Light. He was an economic conservative and he loved every minute of it. Well, the first whiff of economic grape shot, the first bit of real tension, the first downturn, what happens? He drops all that. He drops Bonhoeffer, drops Hayek, drops economic conservatism and becomes a reborn social democrat. All of a sudden. So he's changed 4 times in just a couple of years. He's Australia's, in a sense, Mr. Rudd is Australia's first postmodern Prime Minister because he doesn't actually believe in anything. No one I know has those changes of hearts like that except Mr. Rudd. None at all. My old friend Senator Carr, I always have a go at him, I know, but at least he's wrong. He is wrong about everything, Senator Carr, but at least he believes in something. Mr. Rudd doesn't believe in anything. He changes his mind every second week. He's like this sort of schizophrenic Harry Potter figure, bearing his latest philosophy on some sort of focus group in Labor headquarters in Sussex Street over a Chinese meal and dim sims. That's where he's got this philosophy from. It's pathetic. It's this sort of groupthink. The essay is wrong. Not only is it based on hypocrisy, intellectually it's lazy, ignorant and wrong. Mr Rudd, of course, doesn't like talking about the fact that Mr Blair was one of the great neoliberals of the latter half of the 20th century. Labor Prime Minister. He was one of the most significant neoliberals of the 20th century. As well, of course, as Mr Hawke and Mr Keating, to their partial credit. I'll give them that, to their partial credit. But perhaps even more disturbingly than the fact that there's shocking hypocrisy that the Labor Party adopted neoliberalism as well, even forgetting the hypocrisy, there's a moral argument again here. More people have been moved out of poverty in the last 20 years than have been moved out of poverty in the previous recorded history. More people have moved out of poverty in the last 20 years, Mr President, than have ever moved out of poverty in human history before. And it's not because of communism or socialism or social democracy, but free trade. Yeah, free trade. Free trade and neoliberalism created more wealth for the Chinese than anyone else. The Chinese don't go on it like Mr Rudd does. Mr Rudd takes an advantage, not only of hypocrisy, but of course ignoring great moral arguments. And it's all about what they don't seem to understand, the Labor Party, is it's about good regulation. The fact is, the reason why Australian banks are among the best in the world is because the regulation is very good. The same system that Mr Rudd decries in Australia, the neoliberalism that he criticises, is the same system that gave us the best banks in the world. The same system. So not only is it pathetic, lazy and ignorant, it's just plain wrong. And now it's worse. I understand that our High Commissioners and our ambassadors are having to run around and hawk this to world leaders. When Australia's High Commissioner to the United Kingdom meets Her Majesty the Queen, I suppose he says, "Here, have a look at this," from the Australian Prime Minister. They probably do it in Ulaanbaatar. They take a translation of this and give it to the local president or prime minister or doge or whoever it happens to be. Our diplomats are expected to sort of run around the world with this embarrassing little essay, which is ignorant and hypocritical. Our embassies have been sort of changed into sort of publishing houses these days. I mean, it is a pathetic, intellectually lazy and ignorant piece of work, and then to have our diplomats running around with this. And I wish they'd peddle something I wrote, not rather than this rubbish. Can you imagine asking our diplomats, our High Commissioners and our ambassadors to run around with this stuff? I mean, it's absolutely embarrassing. I feel sorry for them. What are the political, who are the political legatees of this appalling ideology? Well, the principal one at the moment, of course, is... who are the people that love debt? Debt being the new black for the Labor Party. Well, of course, in Queensland, it's Ms Bligh. $74 billion in debt. $74 billion in debt. And she racked up the $74 billion of debt. Guess what? In boom times. She racked up $74 billion of debt in boom times. She's just had record mining receipts, billions of dollars of mining receipts, billions of dollars in property taxes she's received, hundreds of millions of GST, receipts in GST. And do you know what she's done, sir? She's still racked up $74 billion of debt. Now, I thought the $96 billion debt federally in 1996 was bad. That was spread among about, 20 million people. This is $74 billion spread among how many? 4.5 million people. Talk about structural debt. When will this debt ever be paid off, Mr. President? When will it ever be paid off? Of course, Labor Party doesn't worry about that. They don't worry about that. You're not concerned about paying off the debt at all. Because there's one golden rule of Australian politics. Every Labor Prime Minister, from Chris Watson through to Kevin Rudd, spends more money than they raise. They leave more debt. They leave this country with more debt. That is an iron rule of Australian politics. And this diseased DNA is now spreading to the Labor states. And we've got Ms Bligh, $74 billion in debt, and doesn't seem to give a damn. It's costing It costs $10 million a day in interest alone to service that debt, and Ms Bligh doesn't care at all.
Senator Mason, your time has expired.